What's up, heathens? How y'all doing? I'm the Godless engineer, and I critically analyze apologist claims to give you the best arguments and information so that you can stand up and use your voice. Recently, I got a comment that I am taking as a challenge. One day, GE will just upload a response video that consists entirely of previous clips. Challenge accepted. Today, we're going to be taking a look at Tim O'Neill. He recently appeared on a podcast with J Mike. People might recognize J Mike from TikTok and whatnot. In this video, Tim O'Neill spouts the same old bullshit that he's always spouted, and I am only going to use previously recorded clips in order to refute the statements he makes. So today, we're looking at, I believe, 4 different things that Tim O'Neill has said in this interview that has been previously refuted 1,000 times over. So I hope you enjoy this maximum effort video. If you want to fuck around and find out how Tim O'Neill continues to misrepresent mythicism and totally ignore the actual evidence the mythicist hypothesis has, then please stay tuned.
Maximum effort.
It would be compelled by like carriers, but cosmic sperm bank kind of.
The problem that I have and most scholars have with mythicism is that it kind of starts with its conclusion, there was no Jesus, and then tries to find ways to get to that conclusion. And quite often the ways in which it has to do that are pretty fanciful. So because there's references that you just referred to it there. It's referenced in Romans 1:3, where Paul says in passing, according to the flesh, according to his human aspect, he was descended from the seed of David. And to try and find a way to read that as not saying he was a human descendant of a human is pretty difficult. And Richard Carrier is the main proponent of that particular form of mythicism. Jumps through a whole lot of hoops to say, well, he's saying that Jesus was constructed out of sperm that was collected from David and kept in heaven, and there's just no evidence for any of this. It's just fanciful stuff.
Sure.
Now, I know people are convinced by it. Good luck to you if you are. I'm not. I think it's crap, and most scholars are.
Yeah, I'm not a big fan.
It's just contrived. So
first, let's be clear. Romans 1:3 doesn't say exactly what Tim is claiming that it says here. Romans 1:3 says, having come from the seed of David according to the flesh. The reason that this is important is because the way that Tim recites it obfuscates what Paul is really saying here, and that's that Jesus was made from the seed of David. Next, let's try to analyze what Paul could be referring to in this verse about Jesus. You've got 2 ways to interpret this passage. It's either meant allegorically or literally. As for an allegorical reading, that would be interpreted as saying that Jesus is descended from David. Generally, that's how modern Bibles translate this passage. Galatians 3:29 claims that every baptized Christian is the seed of Abraham. Curiously, though, he doesn't say that Christians are made from the seed of Abraham, just that they are the seed of Abraham. So this allegory that we're talking about is something that Paul has kind of done before. But does Paul generally refer to Jesus' body in this same way? How does Paul refer to Jesus' body in other passages? Well, one thing that we do know is that he never uses the most explicit word for human birth, and that's genao. He only ever uses the word genomai, which means to become or to be manufactured. It's worth noting that the Greek interlinear for Paul's epistles actually renders this verse as saying, having come of the seed of David, and not descended from David. But you could still read this as being allegorical. Another aspect that the allegorical interpretation doesn't explain all that well is the fact that Paul only ever uses the word genomai genomai in reference to bodies when he's talking about Adam's body in 1 Corinthians 15:45 and our future resurrection bodies in 1 Corinthians 15:37. And if you think about these two other topics that Paul uses genomai in order to describe, Adam's body definitely wasn't born from anyone. Adam's body was created by God. And then our future resurrection bodies are definitely not birthed by anybody. They are also divine creations of God. So, given that Paul only uses genomai when discussing these three specific topics, it makes sense that Paul most likely thought about Jesus' body in the same way that he thought about Adam's body in our future resurrection bodies. This whole idea gets reinforced in Philippians 2:6-8.
Who, though he was in the form of God, did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped, but emptied himself by taking the form of a servant, being made, genomai, in the likeness of men. And being found in human form, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross.
It's also worth noting here that most translations of this passage use born in the likeness of men. But if you look at the Greek interlinear text, it's actually rendered as having been made in the likeness of men. All of this makes it even more difficult for the allegorical reading of Romans 1:3. It makes it less parsimonious. Why would Paul change the way that he discusses Jesus' body for this one single passage? That would be a weird and strained way of interpreting this section. It's something that the allegorical interpretation of Romans 1:3 can't explain, meaning that the explanatory power of this interpretation is weak. To further weaken the explanatory power of this interpretation, Dr. Bart Ehrman says in his textbook, The Orthodox Corruption of Scripture, in footnote 146, that Romans 1:3 and Galatians 4:4 were routinely replaced with the word genao by later Christian scribes. They obviously didn't like how Paul referred to Jesus' body as being manufactured rather than birthed, so they decided to change it to make it more explicit. So as we can tell, as far as the explanatory power of this interpretation, it's very weak, and it leaves a lot more questions than it answers. So, what about the literal interpretation? How could Paul ever consider Jesus' body to be divinely manufactured using David's seed? As we all know, the two sources that Paul ever cites for information about Jesus are Revelations and Scripture. So the question would be, is there scriptural support for this entire idea in the Septuagint? Which not all Scripture was contained in the Septuagint, but the Septuagint and other things that were considered Scripture that we don't necessarily have now. Tim claims that we have no references to God storing semen in the heavens. Aha, yes, there is, in 2 Samuel 7:12-14.
And when thy days be fulfilled, and thou shalt sleep with thy fathers, I will set up thy seed after thee, which shall proceed out of thy bowels, and I will establish his kingdom. He shall build an house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I will be his father, and he shall be my son.
We also have later Jews that come to similar conclusions about what happens when men have wet dreams during the night. Geoffrey W. Dennis in Jewish Myth, Magic, and Mysticism has this to say about what happens to nocturnal emissions.
The sages regarded the spontaneous emission of semen triggered by erotic dreams as a sign of demonic attack. The succubi, Lilith and Naaman, are the demons traditionally credited with such nighttime molestations. They seduce men in their sleep and extract their sperm in order to procreate demonic offspring. Geoffrey W. Dennis, The Encyclopedia of Jewish Myth, Magic, and Mysticism, page 310.
So we have scriptural support for God harvesting David's sperm so that he could create future descendants that would effectively accomplish exactly what Jesus is said to have accomplished. We also have later Jews developing similar ideas, showing that it could develop naturally within Judaism. This makes a literal interpretation of Romans 1:3 to be more parsimonious and have better explanatory power. So whether God just palmed David's seed until he made Jesus' body, or he stored it in a high-end sperm bank, it still makes more sense to interpret Romans 1:3 in a literal context rather than an allegorical one. You have to work much harder to mold this verse into a historical reference for Jesus. Obviously, it has been peer-reviewed, so relevant scholars have analyzed the argument and found no fault with it. If there were fault, then Carrier would have had to either nix the argument from the book that got peer-reviewed, or he'd have to rework it. Regardless, this argument is in the peer-reviewed literature, so whether or not they agree with it doesn't matter. They didn't find any kind of fault with the argument. Of course, Tim's big comeback to this might be that this particular section of scripture wasn't talking about the Messiah, and he'd probably be correct about the original context. But in the context of pesher creation, though, it's a prime example of a verse that could be easily turned into a pesher about the Messiah. At every single chance that Paul has to refer to Jesus as being born in some kind of way, we don't have that. What we have are explicit words used to indicate that he was manufactured or transformed into a man. I mean, it's like Tim hasn't even read Paul's epistles. He damn sure hasn't even read the minimal mythicist hypothesis. And finally, yes, of course, this entire idea would be implausible if you ignored all of the supporting information. But that is exactly what Tim has to do in order to make this idea seem ridiculous. He has to ignore all of the evidence suggesting it. It's definitely poor methodology to ignore contextual information surrounding Paul.
Which is, if someone includes something in the story which is actually running counter to their intended polemical purpose, then we have to ask ourselves why that bit's in the story. And one potential answer is that it's in the story because it actually happened. So a good example of this from the gospel stories.
The baptism, right?
Yeah, the baptism of Jesus. Yeah. So all four of the gospels have a story where Jesus meets John the Baptist. John the Baptist is baptizing people, and there's an encounter between Jesus and John. What we get is four different stories. They're all telling the same story. John and Jesus encounter each other, and John and Jesus is in some way hailed as the Messiah, but they all do it differently.
Sure.
And the reason they're doing it differently is what shows us that this was a story that they felt they had to tell. Now, does that mean it actually happened? Not necessarily, but it probably did. So it's probably something that actually did happen, and it's probably something that was very significant to Jesus. So it was probably the turning point for him.
Similarly with
here we're getting into speculation.
Before we get to these details that he's going to be going over, there are a lot of problems with the criterion of embarrassment, which is what he's describing here. Mainly, how do we know what would be embarrassing? I mean, these things might be embarrassing to us. We might think that they could be embarrassing to somebody, but that doesn't necessarily translate to these first century Jewish Christians or first century Jews for that matter. So my first question about this is, how do you know what was embarrassing? We don't know the vast landscape of Jewish sects at this period of time. Like that we know that they were varying. We know that there was a diverse set of them, but we don't know what each sect taught, what each sect would consider embarrassing. And I think that the fact that we have many embarrassing testimonies about Jesus that are readily accepted by some groups in the first and second centuries, I feel like that kind of squashes this whole idea that there's something embarrassing about the basic story of Jesus. I mean, there's this one thing that we don't have anymore. It's not extant to us now, but we find references to it in other collections where people have cited these things. And even Dr. Bart Ehrman, he cites some of these things in one of his books. I'm sure that I'll have a reference to it up here somewhere. But Dr. Bart Ehrman has enlightened us about this thing called the Greater Sayings of Mary, I believe is what it's called. And in that, Jesus, I love telling this story. I mean, it's totally nasty, but I feel like it drives home the point of this whole embarrassment deal. Like, oh, this is so embarrassing. Why would people believe this? They wouldn't say this about Jesus. It's so embarrassing. But listen to this story, and then when he's going through these embarrassing supposed embarrassing things, really challenge yourself on, well, is this really all that embarrassing? Because in the greater sayings of Mary, what Jesus does is he takes Mary Magdalene up on top of this mountain, right? And then right in front of Mary Magdalene, he pulls out a fully formed woman from his rib, right? And he takes this fully formed newborn woman out of his rib and butt naked lays her down on top of this mountain and then proceeds to fuck her. Okay, nuts inside of her. And then he reaches into this newly formed woman and pulls out his nut and then looks at Mary and then says something to the effect of, you must do this in order to live, or something like that. Out of this newly formed woman that he essentially just raped right there on the mountain. Now, I tell you this not to be like my normal nasty self, as some people would view me, but this was something that was believed by some people. Like, this was a story that was told in some Christian communities. So really kind of take that into consideration. Oh no, Jesus took a bath in the Jordan. First of all, Jesus being baptized. The original gospel, Mark, actually is an adoptionist gospel where it has the Messiah existing as this incorporeal type of spirit up there with God. And when the figure Jesus, the human figure Jesus, is baptized in the Jordan by John the Baptist, the Messiah figure, this incorporeal being, actually descends upon this human being and inhabits their body and sort of, wears it around like a ghost, like a skinwalker that inhabits a body or something like that, right? So that's in Mark's gospel, and this is an actual academic position that you can look up academic articles about how the gospel of Mark is an adoptionist gospel, and it has the Messiah descending upon this Jesus figure and inhabiting him as soon as he's pulled out of the water by John the Baptist. So Jesus being baptized is something embarrassing. It kind of seems like the initial Christians after Paul, but before the Gospel of Mark, considered this to be needed because the Messiah figure, this pre-existent figure in Judaism, needed to inhabit a physical body on earth. That's how they explained it. So it kind of seems necessary at that point. Not embarrassing, but necessary.
The most likely scenario is the reason they're all telling this story and having to tell it in different ways is because it was something that was remembered as having happened. And there's several other elements in the Gospels that are like that, like the fact that he's from Nazareth. That was a problem for the Gospel writers because the Messiah was meant to be from Bethlehem. So we get these convoluted stories in Matthew and Luke, where he's in Luke he's from Nazareth, but he goes to Bethlehem or his parents go to Bethlehem because of the census. There's all kinds of historical problems with that. Yeah. And he gets born in Bethlehem, so they say, yes, like the Messiah was meant to, he was born in Bethlehem, but then they go home to Nazareth. Except in Matthew, we get a completely different story, where they're from Bethlehem. He gets born there in a house. There's no stable, no shepherds, none of that stuff that you find in Luke. Herod tries to kill him, and so they have to flee into Egypt, hint, just like Moses. And then they come home, and because Herod the Great is dead, but one of Herod's sons is now ruling Judea, which is where Bethlehem is, and so they have to go to Nazareth. They go to Galilee, and they settle in Nazareth, which ignores the fact that another one of Herod's sons was ruling Galilee, so that didn't solve the problem. Yeah. So there's all kinds of problems with his stories, and both of these stories are almost entirely crap. But what they're trying to do is get a guy who was known to be from Nazareth, born in Bethlehem the way the Messiah was meant to. Sure. Why? Well, it seems to be because he was from Nazareth. And that is a common element in all four of the Gospels, that he was from Nazareth. And the fact that he was from Nazareth was actually a problem that's actually highlighted in an episode in the Gospel of John. People say, well, he can't be the Messiah, he's from the wrong town. So
but it's made up out of whole cloth. I mean, why not just do away with the awkwardness, right then and there?
If he didn't exist, then he should be Jesus of Bethlehem. And
exactly.
Because Nazareth doesn't have any significance. Mm-hmm. So it makes most sense. It doesn't mean it's definite. We can't say it's proven, but it makes most sense.
But you get all of these lines that stack up.
For example, a lot of scholars will say that Jesus coming from Nazareth is a historical fact about the real historical Jesus because of the convoluted birth narratives that occur in both Matthew and Luke. But it is equally likely that this idea that Jesus came from Nazareth actually stems from an Old Testament prophecy, most likely Isaiah 11:1 or some lost prophecy or text that we don't have now. It's very plausible that there was some kind of misinterpretation about Isaiah 11:1 that leads a person to think that maybe Jesus was supposed to come from Nazareth. This explanation works really well for Matthew's claim that Jesus being born in Bethlehem and the idea that he was supposed to come from Nazareth actually stems from prophetic origins in the Old Testament. It also explains Mark's call to Nazareth amongst other calls to prophetic origins for Jesus. However, the historical explanation could also explain why Jesus is perceived to come from Nazareth and be born in Bethlehem. But a crucial element is that it doesn't make it automatically more plausible just because it's the historical argument. It means that we cannot know if this was a historical fact about Jesus because it's equally as likely that it was made up. This same process can be used for all of the supposed historical facts about Jesus if there is an equally probable case that this information was just made up either out of whole cloth or by using existing Jewish literature. Then that means you can't determine that it's a historical fact. Just because these scholars agree that these facts are historical facts about Jesus does not automatically make them historical facts. You can analyze their evidence to see if it holds water or not. And for me, these arguments are leaky sons of bitches. It's commonly said by scholars like Bart Ehrman that Nazareth and Galilee in general were backwoods areas that are akin to rednecks from the southern U.S. Ehrman concludes that this wouldn't help advance the Christian narrative, so that must be a true fact about Jesus. This notion about Nazareth stands in stark contrast to what we know people thought about the area during Jesus' time. Herod Antipas commissioned many projects in Galilee and even had a city built in honor of Tiberius there. Galilee was known for its exceptional oil exports, and its governorship was highly coveted, as indicated by Josephus. But even if we assume that Nazareth and Galilee were both backwoods areas that were denigrated by the population, that would exactly fit with the Christian message. All the Gospels use the theme of, quote, the least shall be first, unquote. And the Old Testament is rife with God using unlikely people to complete his tasks, i.e. Gideon.
Right, so what actually happened was Jesus ended up getting crucified, and this is something else that, you know, we can say with fair assurance is a historical fact. It's as close to a historical fact about Jesus as we're going to get. He was crucified, which was a bit awkward for his followers because they had come to believe that he was at the very least a prophet, if not the Messiah himself. And it seems that they probably came to believe that he was the Messiah. So awkward because your Messiah is now dead. So what seems to have happened is they seem to have reconciled that, you know, which is, you know, I suppose pretty much what Steve was talking about before with cognitive dissonance. Well, how can you be crucified and be the Messiah? Oh, well, he's gone on ahead. He's risen in some sense, you know, and we've seen visions of him, so he must have risen. He's coming back. Like the kingdom is still coming, but he's gone on ahead because he's the Messiah, and so he'll be coming back, sitting at the right hand of God. Look, here it is in the book of Daniel. So they found a way to reconcile his death with the message of the coming kingdom. But then the problem became that the kingdom still didn't come.
This was a very awkward thing for me to hear. It is a little confusing considering some information that's recently come to light. Dr. Jason Staples was a student of Dr. Bart Ehrman's when he was doing his dissertation. In Dr. Staples' dissertation, he has a footnote about a pre-Christian idea of a suffering and dying Messiah.
The oft-repeated dictum that there is no evidence for the concept of a suffering and dying anointed one or of a messianic interpretation of the suffering servant in pre-Christian Judaism is therefore mistaken. Jason A. Staples, The Idea of Israel in Second Temple Judaism, page 180.
Among Staples' references includes William Brownlee from 1953, who's discussing A. DuPont Somner's statement about a connection between Jesus and the suffering servant in 1950. What evoked the most astonishment was his disclosure that the teacher of righteousness, founder of the sect of the Scrolls, was in some respects an exact prototype of Jesus, particularly as a martyred prophet, revered by his followers as the suffering servant of the Lord in Deutero-Isaiah. It is inconceivable that this ambiguous form would have been left to stand in the tradition, except for the messianic interpretation of the servant. The Targum supports this interpretation by its reading of 52:13, quote, "Behold my servant, the Messiah," end quote. Hence the oral tradition which antedates the work of the Nazarites may very well have transmitted the vocalization, mihat, for the very reason that it admitted of a messianic interpretation. Brownlee did an in-depth analysis of the Hebrew used in Isaiah in order to make the argument that this suffering servant was in fact communicated to be the Messiah. Staples also includes a number of citations in order to support his point. He cites Louis Ginsberg's The Oldest Interpretation of the Suffering Servant, John Goldingay's commentary on Daniel, and Portier Young's Apocalypse Against Empire, all of which support his point that it's incontrovertible that the suffering servant was interpreted early to be the Messiah. Compounding on this section in Staples' dissertation, we have the Wisdom of Solomon and the Talmud. The Wisdom of Solomon is a first century Jewish text that the Christians heavily relied upon. In Wisdom 2:20, it says this about the Messiah.
Let us condemn him to a shameful death, for, according to what he says, he will be protected.
The entire section of the Wisdom of Solomon 2:12 to 3:3 attests to this pre-Christian idea of a suffering and dying Messiah. In the Talmud B, Sanhedrin 98b and 93b, it connects the suffering servant in Isaiah 52 and 53 to the Messiah. Then in B Sukkah 52a through b, the Talmud has a Christ ben Joseph that dies and then resurrects, even attaching it to an idea in Zechariah 12:10 that mentions piercing the firstborn son of God to death. In On the Historicity of Jesus, Dr. Carrier cites two experts on this topic. One is Martin Hengel, and the other is rabbinical scholar Daniel Boyren. Let's see what rabbinical scholar Daniel Boyren has to say about this topic in his book, The Jewish Gospel, the Story of the Jewish Christ. It has been generally assumed by modern folks that Jews have always given the passage a metaphorical reading, understanding the suffering servant to refer to the people of Israel, and that it was the Christians who changed and distorted its meaning to make it refer to Jesus. Quite the contrary. We now know that many Jewish authorities, maybe even most, until nearly the modern period, have read Isaiah 53 as being about the Messiah. Until the last few centuries, the allegorical reading was a minority position. Aside from one very important, but absolutely unique, notice in Origen's Contra Celsum, there is no evidence at all that any late ancient Jews read Isaiah 52 to 53 as referring to anyone but the Messiah. There are, on the other hand, several attestations of ancient rabbinic readings of the song as concerning the Messiah and his tribulations. There are, moreover, traditions in the Babylonian Talmud, and thus attested from the 4th to the 6th centuries AD, but very likely earlier, the most famous and explicit of which is Sanhedrin 98b. Referring to the Messiah, the Talmud asks there openly, "What is his name?" And various names are proffered by different rabbis. After several different views, we find, quote, "And the rabbis say, the leper of the house of Rabbi is his name. For it says, Behold, he has borne our disease and suffered our pains, and we thought him smitten, beaten by God, and tortured." Isaiah 53:4, end quote. We see here both the vicarious suffering of the Messiah and the use of Isaiah 53 to anchor the idea. There are also various medieval Jewish commentators, among them figures marginal to Rabbinic Judaism, but hardly suspected of Christian leanings, such as the Karate Yefet ben Ali, who clearly understood the Isaiah text and its suffering servant as about the Messiah. The early modern Kabbalist Rabbi Moshe Alshika, also a spotlessly orthodox rabbinite teacher, writes, I may remark then that our rabbis with one voice accept and affirm the opinion that the prophet is speaking of the King Messiah, and we ourselves also adhere to the same view. The intellectual giant of Spanish Jewry, Rabbi Moses ben Naaman, concedes that according to the Midrash and the rabbis of the Talmud, Isaiah 53 is entirely about the Messiah, but he dissents. As we see, neither Judaism nor Jews have ever spoken with one voice on this hermeneutical, theological question, and therefore there is no sense in which the assertion of many sufferings and rejection and contempt for the Son of Man constitutes a break with Judaism or the religion of Israel. Daniel Boyron, The Jewish Gospels, The Story of the Jewish Christ, pages 83 to 85, of the Kindle edition. Oh, so it seems like a rabbinical scholar is making the same argument that Carrier's repeating. The Talmud and the Wisdom of Solomon show that if Jews were really adverse to this idea of a disgraced and dying Messiah, then they wouldn't have separately developed the same ideas as Christians did without first explaining why Jesus didn't fulfill these expectations. So it's very obvious that these ideas were already constructed prior to the development of Christianity. So it seems to me that the more scholarly and more accurate description of the Jews in the first century would be that they had a very diverse landscape of ideas in Judaism. Some Jews did expect a triumphant Messiah figure to conquer Jerusalem for the Israelite people. Then there were also some Jews that were expecting a disgraced and dying Messiah. And some of those Jews ended up developing Christianity into a Hellenistic mystery cult, while the others continued in their sect of Judaism, waiting for their disgraced and dying Messiah, this Christ ben Joseph. Thank you, heathens, for watching today. I really appreciate you watching this maximal effort response video to Tim O'Neill. Let me know what you thought about his arguments down below. Did you think that they were convincing, or do you think that he needs to go back to the drawing board? Let me know. While you're down there, why don't you smash that like button and subscribe if you like this kind of content, and don't forget to stand up and use your voice. Bye, heathens.